if you can't hear, just put your hands up, and I'll try and change my projection. Anyway, welcome everybody. Today's a very important and proud day for the Treasury. We're publishing our long-term fiscal statement. As you know, it's a requirement of Parliament. We've done it in a completely different way to the way we've done things before. I'm going to come on and talk about that, but if I can just firstly introduce Dr. Giro Carajoli, who's to my far right here, who's Deputy Secretary responsible for macroeconomics and this overall subject, and Bill Moran, who's my Deputy Secretary Strategy and who actually led this whole work programme over the last 18 months or so. I'd like to just kick off by just acknowledging the terrific work that Bill did to lead this project to the conclusion that we're seeing today. We have done this completely differently, and the reason for that is we were actually disappointed. There's two reasons for it. One, we were disappointed with the reception that the last one got, and what we're trying to do is to create a much richer conversation around difficult issues that we see in here. And secondly, actually the Treasury is changing. So the way we've done this is actually consistent with the way we're operating much more in our analysis of policy issues, our advice to ministers on policy issues. So we've essentially become much more collaborative and outward-facing in the way we've taken on this work. We've engaged academics. We had a conference. We invited the participation of all sorts of people within the building, within the Treasury, externally, to produce background papers. The pile of papers in front of Bill Moran here is the part and parcel of the document we are publishing today. We, as you probably know, I hope, we organised a competition with schools to get the actual advice and views of the future members of society who are going to be impacted by this stuff more than others. And what we've ended up with, we think, is an incredibly important piece of work that is actually accessible, that flags the issues that we all need to consider as a community and a society. And what I really want to encourage you all to do is not get too obsessed with the numbers. It's very easy for people to look at the numbers and focus on those and lose sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that there is no crisis on the issues that we're addressing here. What there are issues that if we actually start looking at them early, if we start thinking about gradual change rather than change in sort of crisis circumstances, we'll be able to address them in a much more effective way. And there are examples throughout the world of societies having to put in place radical change quickly, which is much, much harder for all the obvious reasons. So what the Treasury wants to see done with this is a recognition that there are real fiscal pressures in the long term, and actually there are choices. There are choices for all of us as a society. And we should start addressing the choices and the issues. And critically, I should flag that what we've put in this document are some options for all of us to think about. We are not making recommendations. This is a report to the government and to Parliament by the Treasury, and we've quite deliberately decided that actually what's important here is a menu of options that people can think about, debate, and make choices between. So for us, success will be creating a national conversation, if you like, on the issues that are here. To a certain extent, we've already succeeded. I don't know if you've actually seen the products that the school kids who are involved in this stuff have produced, but I think we have actually started a conversation with them. And what I'm looking forward to is to starting a much broader conversation with a much broader part of the community. And that's where you guys come in. The media have got an incredibly important role to play in ensuring that the messages are communicated clearly, that the issues are presented factually, and that debate is encouraged and deliberation is encouraged and conversation is encouraged. So I'm hoping that with our support, but also with your support, we'll actually succeed in getting the issues out there on the table in a properly considered way, and that the community as a whole will start to think about the choices it has and will start to make those choices in a gradual way which will be more acceptable and ultimately help all of us. So that's all I want to say and kick off right now. I'm conscious you guys have got deadlines and schedules and you'll want to get back. Remember there's an embargo till 2 o'clock, so please observe it. I'm happy to take some questions. Bill and Garol are happy to take some questions, and we've got a few people here who will also be able to answer questions. But
you talk about choices, but there seems to be much more focus in the document about choices for cutting spending than for raising taxes. There's a passing acknowledgement that increasing the tax to GDP ratio by 2 percentage points would go a long way towards closing the gap that you've read. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of quantification around that alternative or options there compared with what you might do with health and super and education and welfare and all the other. Isn't there a bias in this approach towards cutting or capping or restricting growth and spending rather than looking at the revenue side?
Well, I don't think so, and that's because what we're flagging in this report is actually the pressures on the pressures that are going to hit us in the future aren't the lack of revenue, but they're actually pressures on the spending side, which is essentially what this document is trying to flag up. So that's why it's focused on, from your perspective, that's why you might see more of a focus on spending, because that's where the challenges are emerging in areas like health and the other ones that were mentioned. The tax side is in there, and there are lots of beautiful tax systems in the world. There's lots of ways that we could sort of debate about designing tax raising options. But I wouldn't characterise it the way you have, Ryan. That's just the reality of what it is, what the issues are that we're facing.
I think I'll just add to what Captain just said. All the background papers go through a broader menu of options, but for the statement itself, all we've provided is a list of options, the sorts of things that could be considered, and we focus on the major levers, whether it's super, health, or tax. But the broader papers go into some of the principles that might drive options around reducing the growth of spending. I mean, in terms of health, it's not, in terms of the illustrative option, it's not cutting health spending, it's reducing the rate of growth.
I mean, you say that these are simply options, but when do you get to the point, though, of making clear recommendations to the government? Because obviously some of these options, say take around super, there are political ramifications that we've got the existing government, Prime Minister having made a pledge around that. But I mean, when does the Treasury start to actually turn these into recommendations?
When we feel that we absolutely need to start making specific recommendations, we will do. But at the moment, what we're doing today with this is actually publishing a set of projections going over 40 years. We don't need to make recommendations today. We tend to make recommendations around budget time. And that's when we'll make recommendations, but we don't actually need, and it's actually quite important, I think, that we don't make, we'll quite deliberately not make recommendations because we think it's much better to have a conversation because there are choices here for people. So, I much prefer to have the conversation, have the debate, which we will participate in, and hopefully everyone will participate in, and then we'll be in a better place to make recommendations. But at the moment, we're talking on timescales that we don't absolutely need. As I said earlier, there is no crisis.
But the earlier, yes, but the earlier you start to make some changes, the more gradual they can be,
absolutely,
and the less impact they have.
So I would encourage the early conversations.
So just to put on what Gav said, the advice we have provided was at the time of the last election, and we said that fiscal objectives should focus on getting net debt down to around 20% by 2020, because that not only deals with the immediate fiscal pressures, but helps manage your long-term pressures by the early gradual change. So in terms of the bias, that's the anchor advice. In terms of governance, they have different political philosophies and values, and they've got to weigh up the choices between the options. And what we're trying to do for this statement is identify the key options and the trade-offs and the different effects across options. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not here through this statement to tell government or parliament what they should do, because there's got to be a broader conversation if the options or policies that are followed are going to be enduring. So what we're trying to do is provide an information set which is robust and as neutral as possible.
Just looking at figure 4 here, it seems that one of the options could be for the government to maintain its current real spending growth versus discretionary chunks that have been running for the last couple of years, and just leave it at that.
Sorry, I'm trying to find figure 4.
Page 19.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Keeping the current
Sure.
fiscal strategy to 2020, which is having those limits on growth, essentially.
Yeah, I mean,
And then just doing nothing.
yeah, two things on that, Bernard. One is certainly if all governments in the future stick to the current sort of strategy, it would make a big help, make a big difference. What this particular graph doesn't show, and I'm pretty confident the background papers may actually have this, is that if you extend that that line, the horizontal axis out, that curve starts to come up. So it doesn't solve all your problems forever.
And just a corollary to that, on page 18, it's got some information about cost to delay. And in effect what it's saying is the longer governments take to address the issue, the longer the time it will take to actually get back to a net 20%. So that's on page 19, which says if you wait 5 years versus 10 years versus 13 years, the longer you delay addressing it, the longer the time will be to get back to 20%.
And that raises the question about national superannuation. The longer you delay, I guess, the increase to 67, the more difficult it becomes in the future. I mean, why isn't the Treasury being a bit more direct on that one? Because, you know, looking at the figures here, the ageing population is going to require, obviously, a significant change there somewhere.
We're not making a specific thing today. We don't feel we need to. And actually the reality is that governments do have choices around it. And you know, the current government itself has clearly made a choice.
Going back to Brian's question about the balance between controlling costs and tax.
Yeah.
Is there a way to calculate resuming the historic tax increase revenue? Or is that as such? I mean, you got it at 29%.
Yeah.
Is that the historical trend, or is the historical trend tended to be more revenue? I'm just trying to say, is it possible to have both sides of this equation balanced?
Let me just, I'm going to ask Matt to come
The,
in here.
the assumption around the 29% tax is largely one of, if you take the 40-year average of tax revenue, it's probably about 30%. But what we've, to some degree, predicted out is the current tax system. So over the last decade or 20 years, it's been more like 29. The current tax system in the world of projections that are cycle-free, etc., would be around about 29% of GDP in a stable world. That's what we've modelled. Now,
isn't this the point that Brian was getting around to, that you've adopted a historical spending or a historical cost track, but not the historical revenue track?
Well, yeah, I'd say actually we have adopted the historical revenue track because that's about the average. But to answer that and also to refer to the question that Brian said a little earlier, which was referred to, the background paper on tax actually examines an enormous number of options around tax, dealing with the problem to some degree, far more than we've ever done before, and that does include ones that have tax rising with things like allowing real fiscal drag, with new tax systems, with changes to GST. So they have been modelled, but generally New Zealand's tax to GDP ratio it's been all over the place with cycles and things, of course, but as a rough average over those 40 years, what we're projecting isn't too far off, and we're trying to sort of capture to some degree the ageing population element in the expenditure, which is not quite so obvious in the revenue, but we're certainly not saying there aren't revenue solutions that can be brought in, and I would encourage people interested on the tax side to look at the background paper on tax, because it honestly does examine a huge amount of options.
Following on from Barry's question, looking at the costs of super projected and the differences it makes to move up to 67, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that the move to 67 makes a marginal difference, but it's actually the indexation rather than the adjusting of the wages that makes a huge difference.
Indexation cost, but it's not the whole answer.
No, but the bigger of those two elements is the indexation of inflation as opposed to inflation.
That's right.
You say it's
Can I just a couple of points to just be very clear. One is that well, I think that answers your historic tax question. But the point I made at the beginning is one that I hope you guys don't lose sight of, and I don't want to do too much reading. But all those background papers are part of this stuff. So although this is the official statement, there are probably loads of answers to questions you've got in the background papers. So if there are questions you feel that we're not answering, that aren't answered in the document, do ask, because we will be able to point you to background papers where there'll be a lot more information.
You said it wasn't a crisis. How long has this government or any government got before they need to make a decision?
Well, the reality is that the sooner we make decisions and choices, the better. So at one level, the answer to your question is how much pain does the government want to incur, and how much pain does it think the community will be prepared to take on when they make changes. So, it's almost an unanswerable question. I mean, at the moment, the current government's got a strategy of reducing debt to GDP 20% by 2020, and it's that in itself is a very clear objective. It won't be as straightforward, but they're committed to it, and they've made those decisions. So that's actually that's helpful already. So that decision has been made. But if you try to get me to pin me down that if on a particular day that if that decision hasn't been made, we'll have a crisis, I'm not going to speculate on that.
What option would you like to see?
You're not going to get me to start making the recommendations that I was asked to whether I was going to make at the moment. The option I'd like to absolutely be seized here is one where we have a conversation, that we treat this document seriously, that we don't sort of, like most government documents, put it on the shelf and then ignore it. That's the option I'd like to be seized.
Has the government had any involvement in the production of this document?
No, this is a Treasury document.
So,
but obviously, the government's decisions are reflected in here. So the government's decisions on getting to 20% GDP 2020 is reflected in here. But the preparation of this is entirely the Treasury's.
And the summary document wasn't passed through the Minister's office and amended in any way?
No.
I think the other comment I make is over the last 18 months we've run a very public process about the development of the document and the background papers. And all the papers have been available on the web to all political parties.
Yeah.
So there's been no bias or favour for the government versus others.
I mean,
and the information has been transparent and open and available.
I mean, the issue that's being raised here is that the document reflects a fairly narrow range of potential possibilities, whereas your research, as you point out, covers a very, very wide gamut of possibilities. For example, if you increase education spending, you might expect that to have an impact on productivity over the long term. And I mean, that's something which is apparently considered in one of the papers, but it's certainly not addressed in the document at all. So the document's reflecting your expectations about, to some extent, about what government policy currently is, because this is a 4-year process, or when you do this every 4 years, don't you?
Yeah. Parliament requires us to do this every 4 years. But I mean, I think the document is a valiant attempt at actually crystallising in a readable, in an accessible way, a series of complex issues for the country. And we had to make choices as to how we were going to present all this stuff. And we could have written a 1,000-page document, but actually we decided it was much more important for it to be accessible to ensure conversation. So that it's a very informed piece of work as a result of the background paper, as a result of conversations. But, it doesn't pretend to be completely comprehensive on everything.
You say in this document that irrespective of if we had better growth than expected, it wouldn't really make it material. Why is that? I mean, surely if we lifted growth by 1 percentage point a year over that period, that presumably would mean more tax, more ability to spend, and less strain on resources.
We're certainly not for 1 second. I don't think you'll ever hear anyone from the Treasury saying we shouldn't go for growth. Of course we should go for growth. It's something we've been talking about for a long time. We'll always say that's something that's going to help any economy. What we're trying to get at here is there's certain, particularly in that cost pressures one where it builds up, there's a certain flow through wages. So yes, you're absolutely right. If you got higher growth, you would get higher GDP and a higher tax take. All of those things are true. Chances are you'd also have higher pressures on expenditure. For a start off, New Zealand Super's linked to the average wage, so that would rise. Also, it's unlikely that forever and a day you'd be able to maintain the wage pressures in the various expenditure areas, so they would rise too. So in that particular world, it would take an enormous amount of growth, and we've tried in this statement to be, while they are all assumptions and they can be criticised, etc., we've tried to stay grounded in reality into sort of growth levels that we've seen in the past or could ostensibly hope to get. It's no good putting in something to say we could rise to 10% a year and that solves the problem, because it's probably not going to happen. So we've addressed that side of things, but we certainly don't want to send a message across that, oh, we're not looking for growth. Of course we are, and of course that will help, but the message is more, we'll have to do other things as well. There are significant challenges coming in the demographic structure, and they can be dealt with, but you can't just hope to deal with it all through, hope to grow your way out of it.
In terms of the background papers, Paul Rodway's paper actually goes through different assumptions around growth and labour force participation, etc., and does sensitivity analysis, and it shows it doesn't make a material difference. It doesn't solve this problem.
So what percentage does the net debt sit at now?
As of today, about 24%.
Yeah, something like that. In that mid-20s range.
And it will go up before it goes down.
Yeah, they're projected to rise a bit more over the forecast period and then eventually start to tip.
There's a chart on page 29, which is a good description of the political problems of waiting. It seems to show that the further out you go, the higher proportion of the population who are aged over 45 to 50. And therefore, if they were voting for their own self-interests, would be less likely to actually make the changes which solve the problem.
Yeah.
Therefore, do you think that makes it even more important to make a decision early on? I think it's political demographics.
A gradual change early. If the Treasury has a preference, which I would be resisting a temptation, it is for early gradual change. So you're right.
The projections, if we're to take the projections in health costs from 6.9 to 10.8% of GDP as a major problem,
Yep.
Should we assume on the other side of that coin that afford and welfare from 6.7 to 3.8 is a boon, and that we don't need to worry so much about controlling welfare expenditure?
I'm from the Treasury, and we need to always worry about controlling expenditure, because history tells us that if we don't have at least one organisation that focuses hard on controlling expenditure, it starts to run away with itself. So I would, for me, it's all expenditure is important, not least because the Treasury will always want to make sure there's value for money in expenditure, and ultimately because that helps you in your choices.
But demographics are doing a fair amount of the work in terms of the welfare expenditure for you without
That's
the
right.
other changes.
Well,
No, that's not really
it's not just demographics.
Yeah. The welfare expenditure is partly around the assumption of CPI indexation. So if there's policy change there, that could change that welfare track. Also, keep in mind that welfare is very volatile in terms of cycles and things, and tends to be not that symmetric. It tends to rise a lot quicker in terms of recipient numbers than it falls. The projections don't have cycles. It's hard to second guess cycles, but so you could see certainly quite significant periods of rise, and we don't try and second guess in policy change. So it might be that recipient numbers are a lot lower in the future, but so it's mainly though, once you get past the forecast period where it has been built in impacts of the welfare reform, there's not a huge amount of demographic stuff going on there. It's more to do with the CPI indexation.
And I think the other thing I'd point out is looking at the row in that table, the 6.7 reflects cyclic in terms of the GFC impacts, whereas the other numbers reflect our model.
Could you tell us where we arrive at a 1.5% labour productivity assumption from?
That's our historic, that's the historic.
How historic? Would you have to go back and feel way to
Well, it's a difficult one in the sense that it does depend on the periods that you choose. It's a very erratic measure. So there are periods you can certainly find decade averages of that. It's not a hugely optimistic assumption. It's probably a little stronger than we've seen in recent times. But there are certainly periods where that has been achieved over about a 20 to 30 year average. You can get pretty close to that value of 1.5, and it does depend on the period in which you pick.
And
it can be criticised, but I wouldn't say it's enormously optimistic or anything.
I note that we have Brian Easton on our external panel who's done a lot of extensive research and analysis, and he says that the historic rate going back to 1880 is 1.6%.
On a population, GDP growth per population real basis, going to 1894, it's about 1.6% per annum. Which is more or less as a matter of intellectual interest, the same as the OECD, according to that work.
Could one of the options here to solve this problem be a major change in migration policy, importing a lot of young, thickened people?
Shall I pick it up? This is a fascinating question we are doing quite a bit of work on. In fact, there was a discussion with quite a few external and internal people, including academics, on the impact of migration in the long run. The evidence is very, very unclear. So there is no obvious migration policy that comes out which can help with increasing our real GDP growth per head of population. We had historians, we had econometricians, we had all kinds of people in the room looking at history both across the world and across the history of New Zealand. There is no obvious immigration policy that will help with that.
Wouldn't the changing population structure, having a lot of young migrants?
If it were highly skilled people coming in at a young age and so on, if you can zoom in that way, then of course that would have a positive impact. But there is no immigration policy that we can think of that will actually get you to that kind of very nice razor edge solution.
What was it about the last, you said you were disappointed about the reaction to the last of these reports you released. What was it that disappointed you?
Well, it didn't. I mean, basically people looked at the graphs. You guys wrote stories about it. It's all going mad. And, you know, the stuff was then filed away. Or we focused on specific things that people talked about, you know, the age of super and stuff like that. And as I said at the beginning, if that happens again, then we've failed. Actually, because what we want to do is to actually have proper conversations about the issues here, because there are choices. That's the point. There are choices, and the best thing we can do is make informed decisions.
That's largely ruled out by the political statements of the current government, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a 40-year thing. Right. So,
but it's been released this
some
year.
point.
Yeah, I mean, our problem is that the only conversation we can have with politicians is with the current problem.
But, that's a good point. But, I don't want the conversation to just be with politicians. I want the conversation to be...
That should be the only conversation, but I mean, that is...
No,
they are the leaders of the current political thinking of the country.
Yeah, well, they are the leaders of the current capital people in the thinking, but I think you'll find there are lots of people around the country who are interested in these issues. Now, you know, the McGuinness Institute led a piece of work where we got a bunch of young people publish, I can't remember what they called it, Long-Term NZ. Right, so these are young people who are interested in the issues that are in here. So we want them to be part of the conversation.
But isn't that
for example?
Isn't what you're trying to do then is create a conversation that puts pressure on the current government to change the policy settings and its
not really. No, because we've got an election in a year's time, and the issues here are not about making decisions in the next year. Right, so this is about a conversation that just needs to happen, and governments need to, whatever colour, will then have choices to make. So it's there isn't that sort of crisis that we need a decision in the next 6 months.
So you hope the electorate's better informed before the next election?
Well, the next election, the one after that. I mean, actually, just generally, let's have the conversation. Let's have the discussion. And to be fair, I keep going back to the long-term NZ thing and young people. There are people out there who just want to have a conversation. They want to talk about what are the choices facing the country, and they don't necessarily feel that we've got to make a decision in the next year, but they just want to be talking about it.
There has been a conversation over the last couple of years, hasn't there? We have seen one party change its policy as a result of that conversation, so it's not the lack of a conversation, is it?
Well, let's hope there's an even better conversation than maybe the last.
So these 4 options outlined in this little booklet here are in no particular order then?
Of those options, which one would reduce inequality the most? Have you looked at the equality outcome of each of those options?
I don't know whether we can answer that question in detail. I mean, we've used our living standards framework to analyse a whole bunch of these options, and increasing equity is one of the dimensions of that. But I'm not sure I can be as specific.
But I do want to, since I have the opportunity with that question, talk about the framework we are bringing to analyze precisely that question. Maybe 10 years ago, the answer would have been given exclusively on economic growth kind of basis, but the living standards framework is the Treasury's way of looking at how do we improve the living standards of New Zealanders, and in that context, how do you actually measure the quality of decisions. And what we're talking about is in terms of the wider social benefits and welfare function, we are saying income is one, sustainability is the other one, which is one of the other corners. Equity issues, both across society and across generations, have to be taken into account when assessing these matters. Social cohesion and related matters need to be taken into account. And overall, sitting on top of that, related closely to the sustainability issue, is risk management. So what we are doing is using those 4 kind of examples as a way of illustrating how a much richer analysis needs to be done in assessing the policy. So it's no longer an easy solution in that regard. That's why we are holding the mirror, and we are saying these are the kinds of things we need to take into account in making decisions.
I think the other thing I'd add in terms of the options, we went through an external panel process. We had 7 sessions, and we asked them for feedback on which option should we put in the document for illustrative purposes. And I think the advice they gave us was if you spread it too wide, then you won't get the right sort of discussion, so keep it narrow. So that informed our choice, but that doesn't mean that these are the options that individually should be taken up by government now or later. It's more to ensure that if you do have a debate, you don't debate it at the margins, you debate it on the fundamentals in terms of the key choices. So you look across the key trade-offs, and probably the thing that's really different from this statement versus the other statements, but also a lot of the analysis you see around policy advice, this does start getting into the tricky area of intergenerational impacts, because whatever decisions you make will have impacts in terms of the burdens and how they're shared across time. And
both the tax options, though, would make the tax system over time less progressive. Are you okay with that? Is that in terms of your framework?
It comes down to the options you've got available, how you see the trade-offs across them. I mean, the tax system may be less progressive, but it's still a regressive system in terms of principles.
So there's 4 options in this booklet. Where do we find the meaning, if you like, of all the options?
They're in these background papers. So
they're on the website.
So is there one paper?
Are they in there?
It should be on the stick.
They're on the your USBs.
And you should have papers by sector of tax through the spending areas like education, health, justice, natural resources, so they should be all listed.
This is your third such report, is it part of your brief to then look back about the way the options that you suggested in earlier reports have been taken up by the government? For example, I think in your 09 report you talked about public spending in the public sector and for greater efficiencies were needed in that area. Can you go back and assess and score how the options that you suggest are being embraced or not by the government?
In this document, what we're required by Parliament is to look ahead. Whether we'll ever decide to do a look back, that's something for us to think about. But I mean, what tends to happen, of course, is that there are other documents that we publish, our economic and fiscal updates twice a year, which do reflect the choices that governments do make, and that there are those, and that's where we give our views on those.
So for New Zealanders not versed in economic policy, which I'll probably fall into that category. You talk about wanting to generate discussion and conversation. Yeah. What would you suggest would be the most important things that New Zealanders should be talking about in terms of the information put in the report? The man on the street.
Well, I mean, I think there's, maybe the words that Bill and Gerald just used are some of the interesting ones, which is the intergenerational impacts of some of the choices that we make, I think. So we can make choices now about NZ Super or health spending, which have significant impacts on future generations. And it's those sorts of choices, really, that ought to be part of the conversation.
But I also want to challenge the statement that was made that New Zealanders will not be that interested in economic policy discussion. Actually, one of the most beautiful and refreshing aspects of this whole process was how engaged the school kids were. Right across the country in terms of thinking about these issues. They are very interested in this matter, and they are thinking very hard. The kind of ideas that came and were articulated in this very room are just unbelievable. It's just a matter of giving them an opportunity to participate. Is that what we're finding? And so this has become part of our overall engagement program, going to schools and asking their opinions on a lot of issues. So that is very exciting stuff.
You need a long-term fiscal expected.
You organise it with me.
How would you describe the intergenerational fairness of do nothing? How unfair or fair would be to let it go to this?
You're asking me as a 50-something-year-old, you get a different answer to if you asked a 20-something-year-old. And that's one of the issues that the Long-Term NZ group came up with. They actually did feel, and I'm probably being unfair to them, but they did feel that the current settings were unfair to them. So,
you've got this new Pentagon model for
living standards, yeah, which is what Gerard just described.
Yeah, so are you going to apply that to a lot of other stuff that Treasury does?
Yeah.
So you're going to use the little wee icons and describe and...
I don't know the precise graphics.
I don't know, but
we are basically increasingly our analysis of the sort of big policy issues is being done through the living standards framework. So we're not just, again to repeat what Gerard just said, we're not just looking at what will the effect of this particular initiative be on growth. Absolutely, we will consider that, but we'll also consider the impact on sustainability, or the impact on equity. So those 5 dimensions of that framework are going to be increasingly the bedrock on which we will do our analysis.
So they're going to be standardised into all reports by Treasury?
I wouldn't go so far as say they're going to be standardised into reports. What they will be, they'll be the foundation on which the people in this building do their analysis and provide their advice. Whether they actually, every report that we publish, whether it actually comes out in some pictorial form, But increasingly, I don't know, I suspect it won't, but increasingly what will be the case is that the vast majority of issues that are addressed out of this building will be looked at through the lens of that living standards framework. I think it's time to wrap up, guys. Okay, thanks very much.